Could this new Tamron 70-300 lens a good choice for Sony shooters who want a good telephoto lens but don't want to spend a lot of money? Let's find out in this video. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the new Tamron 70-300 F4.5-6.3 Di III RXD telephoto lens. 70-300 is quite a popular telephoto lens choice, and Tamron has made many other 70-300 lens in the past, but this one is the first one that they specially designed for mirrorless camera, and it is available for the Sony E-mount cameras. The lens feels a little bit plastic, just like the other Tamron lenses designed for the Sony E-mount cameras, and there's no switches or buttons at all on the lens. But it does have a metal rear mount, and also the lens is weather sealed, so it shouldn't be a problem if you want to use it to shoot photos or videos under a bit of rain, even though the build quality outside seems to be a little bit plasticky. Tamron say this lens is the world's smallest, but I don't think they are talking about the length of the lens, because the length of the lens seems to be very similar to the other 70-300 lenses that I have used in the past. I think what they mean is the outer diameter of the lens, which is 77mm, which is a little bit narrower than the other 70-300 lenses in the market. But on the other hand, this lens does feel a lot lighter than the other 70-300 lenses that I have used in the past, because the weight of this lens is only 545 grams. And I guess part of the reason is because it doesn't have a built-in optical image stabilizer, and also the telephoto and the maximum aperture is f6.3 if you compare it with the Sony 70-300 lens, which has the very similar overall length, but it's quite a bit heavier. But that lens, the maximum aperture at the 300mm is a little bit faster at f5.6. When you zoom in the lens would extend quite a bit. So if I change it from the 70-300, you can see the total length of the lens does extend quite a bit. Now, I mentioned that there's no switch or buttons on the lens at all, but I don't think this is a problem in terms of lens creep. Even if I shake it, it doesn't seem to extend. There's no lens creep. Even if I turn it halfway and I shake it a little bit, the lens wouldn't extend by itself. The front filter thread is 67mm, which is exactly the same as all the other lenses that Tamron specially designed for the Sony E-mount cameras. That means the 3 prime lenses, the 20mm, 24 and the 35mm, and also the 4 other zoom lenses, the 17-28, the 28-75, and also the 70-180, and also the recently released 28-200 lens. They all take the 67mm. I just really like how Tamron has planned and designed all the lenses that take the same size filter. It just makes it a lot easier. You only need to take and buy one size CPL or ND filter instead of having to buy a new filter every time you buy a new lens. As this lens doesn't have a constant aperture design, so the maximum aperture would reduce when you start zooming the lens. So this chart shows you what is the maximum aperture that is available when you are using this lens. So from 70-100mm, the maximum aperture is 4.5, and from 110mm to around 155, the maximum aperture is f5. And then the maximum aperture remain at f5.6 until around 240-250mm focal length, and from that point onward, the maximum aperture remains at f6.3. This Tamron 70-300 lens uses Tamron's RXD stepping autofocus motor. The autofocus speed is very fast, especially when you are shooting under bright sunlight, and also the autofocus operation is very quiet. Even when I put the lens right next to my ear and just try to hear the autofocus noise indoor, I could barely hear any autofocus noise at all, which make it very suitable if you want to use it to shoot a bit of video. And if you want to shoot a bit of portrait with this lens, the IAF also works perfectly with this lens. Probably because Tamron wants to minimize the size and weight of this lens, so this Tamron 70-300 lens doesn't have any optical image stabilizer built in. What that means is you have to rely on the camera's in-body image stabilizer for the image stabilization. So I was a bit concerned about that because the maximum focal length of this lens is 300mm, which is pretty long. So I did a bit of test with a Sony a7 III. I shot about 60 photos at different shutter speed from 1/320th second down to 1/80th seconds, and all the photo I just shot with me just hand holding the camera. I just standing there with nothing supporting me. And when I look at the photos, I was actually a bit surprised because all these 60 photos I shot with the a7 III, every single one of them, the image is sharp, so there's no shaking because of my handshake at all. That is pretty good because I can get down to 1/80th seconds, maybe even slower than that, and I can still get sharp photos pretty much 100% of time, so that is pretty good. But then, how about video? If you want to use this lens to shoot some video, what would the result be like? First, I shot this video at the wide end at 70mm. Again, me just standing there with nothing supporting me, and the footage is very stable, so definitely no problem at all. Then I increased the focal length to 135mm, and the result with the a7 III is still pretty good. There is very minimal amount of shake when I shoot this video at 135mm focal length. And then I did one more test, and this time at the maximum focal length 300mm. If you compare it with the previous video clips, this one is definitely not as steady as the two previous clips. But overall, I think it is still pretty usable. And here is a side-by-side comparison with me disable the IBIS on the a7 III. And you can see the results with the IBIS is actually pretty steady. If you want to have even more steady results, then I would recommend you probably lean your body on something or use some support, maybe use some monopod. Then you should be able to get some really steady footage even when you are shooting at the maximum focal length. Okay, next let's have a look at the image quality, and as usual start from the image sharpness first. At 70mm, the center sharpness is very good even at the maximum aperture f4.5. When I stop down to f5.6, the center become really sharp. And if we look at the corner, at the maximum aperture, I think the corner is usable, but I would say it is slightly soft. It improves a lot when I stop down to f5.6, and when I stop down to f8, it becomes really sharp as well. At the telephoto end 300mm, center sharpness is great at the maximum aperture f6.3 already. And if we look at the corner, at the maximum aperture, it is actually already pretty sharp at f6.3. And when I stop down to f8, then it becomes very sharp. Overall, the image sharpness from this Tamron 70-300 is definitely better than I expected. This Tamron 70-300 lens has built-in lens profile for things like distortion or vignetting correction. If you disable the distortion compensation, you may notice there is a small amount of distortion at some of the focal length. But overall, I think Tamron did a pretty good job at minimizing the amount of distortion with this 70-300 lens, because even if I disable the distortion compensation feature on the camera, the amount of distortion is still kept at a very low level. If I disable the shading compensation on the camera body, at 70mm, there is some noticeable vignetting at f4.5, and it will start to improve when I stop down the lens. But even when I stop down to f8, there is still a small amount of vignetting that is noticeable. And at 300mm, there is some strong vignetting at the maximum aperture f6.3 and also at f8, but it becomes a lot better when I stop down to f11. Remember, you can minimize the amount of vignetting by enabling the shading compensation feature on your camera body. Even though this lens doesn't have a really fast aperture, but because of its long focal length, you can still create some very shallow depth of field photo with the background dissolved quite easily, especially when you are shooting at the telephoto end of this lens. In terms of bokeh, I can see a bit of highlight near the edge of the bokeh, and when you are shooting at the maximum aperture, there is also a bit of cat's eye bokeh effect near the edge or corner of the frame. So I probably wouldn't call it a bokeh monster, but for an affordable telephoto lens, I think the quality of the bokeh is pretty acceptable. Lens flare control seems to be very decent with this 70-300 lens. Even when I'm shooting directly into the sun at the maximum aperture, I still get very minimal amount of lens flare and ghosting. And also this lens comes with a pretty deep lens hood, which definitely can help to minimize the amount of lens flare or ghosting. Tamron also did a very good job at minimizing the amount of chromatic aberration with this 70-300 lens. Even when shooting some very high contrast photos at the maximum aperture, the amount of color fringing, there is a little bit of color fringing in some of my test photos, but overall the chromatic aberration performance is a lot better than what I was expected. I think this is another very solid, even though it does feel a bit plasticky lens from Tamron. This could be a very good choice for people who already have the Tamron 28-75 2.8 lens or one of the Tamron prime lens, and either they don't want to spend a lot of money to get the 70-180 2.8, or they want something that can cover a little bit longer range up to 300mm, then this would be a very good lens to go with the other Tamron lens that they already have. Especially you can share the same 67mm front filter between those lenses. Even though this lens, the price is very affordable, but the image quality is actually not bad at all. The image sharpness, chromatic aberration, lens flare, and even the distortion control, they are all pretty decent. Now, while I haven't done any side-by-side comparison with the Sony 70-300 lens this time, which I believe is probably the biggest and most closest competitor with this Tamron lens. But looking at the image quality from this Tamron lens, I really don't expect the Sony could be a lot better than this Tamron lens at all. Now, the Sony does have the advantage that the maximum aperture at the telephoto end is f5.6 instead of f6.3, so that is a little bit faster. And also the Sony lens also have the optical image stabilizer built in, so that should have better image stabilization compared to this Tamron lens. But on the other hand, this Tamron is quite a bit lighter, which make it very good if you want to bring this lens to travel with you. But the most important thing is the price of this Tamron lens is just half the price of the Sony lens. So this makes this Tamron a very attractive choice for people who want to buy a compact telephoto lens and you can save a lot of money.